Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. In the last two episodes, Scandinavian society has changed radically. In a generation or two, the ancient agrarian society where basically everyone worked in the production of food disappeared. The average Scandinavian went on to become an urbanized, salaried factory worker. I exaggerate, of course, but not by much. Today, we'll look at another greatly important social change in the 1800s, namely the emigration to America. I think that's extra suitable for today's episode since the United States is actually celebrating 250 years of independence tomorrow, if you're listening to this episode on the date it's released. Episode 137, From Fjords to Frontiers. Since the dawn of time, or at least since the agrarian revolution, most people rarely ventured beyond the village where they were born. If you exclude the poor sods who were sent off to war, of course. It was a privileged few who had traveled abroad, let alone to another continent. But like so much else, this too changed in the 1800s. Now, with new modes of transport and news traveling wider and faster than ever before, people became aware of the greater world beyond them. First, the country in which they lived, and later, also the rest of the world. Moving someplace else, someplace better, became a possibility. A possibility more and more people started to turn into a reality. Millions of Scandinavians emigrated across the Atlantic, primarily to the US, but also to Canada and even South America. The movement culminated in the decades around the turn of the last century. The immigrants sometimes kept in touch with their relatives who remained in Scandinavia for a generation or so, but the connection to the old country was lost eventually. Still, some Americans continue to cultivate their Scandinavian identity for much longer, and thanks to new DNA technology, they're now able to reconnect with distant relatives back in Scandinavia. In general, modern-day Scandinavians aren't really aware, more than in the vaguest of senses, that this mass emigration to America actually took place. Unless they get a DNA match with an unknown third cousin in Minnesota, of course. But at the time, it was a hotly discussed topic. Today, we'll delve into the reasons why people pulled up stakes, where they settled, what happened to them once they got there, and what the people who stayed behind thought of it all. Scholars who study migration usually talk of push and pull factors, meaning that people choose to leave their homes and move somewhere else either because they're pushed away or because they're pulled in by something attractive about the place they're moving to. Scandinavian immigration to America displays both push and pull factors. If we start with what pushed people to leave, there are a number of things that spring to mind. We've touched upon most of them in the last two episodes, actually. For instance, we've already talked about the population in Scandinavia ballooning in the 1800s. Scholars have summed this up with three key words: peace, potatoes, and vaccines. First of all, peace. Pretty self-explanatory, I guess. Traditionally, Scandinavians had been plagued by war more or less constantly, either between Denmark and Sweden or with some other European country, usually Russia or Germany. But this changed in the 19th century. The invasion of Norway in 1814 was Sweden's last war to date, and Norway was also at peace until the Second World War. After the Russian occupation, Finland also enjoyed almost a century of peace, called Pax Russica. Denmark is the only exception here, since it fought Germans in various constellations twice over the control of Schleswig and Holstein. Moving on, potatoes refers to the radically improved food situation, both thanks to the land reforms and new technologies, but also thanks to the introduction of potatoes on a wide front. Potatoes are both nutritious and sturdy. Wheat is a temperamental crop, sensitive to bad harvests, leading to hunger and starvation. But potatoes are reliable, and they kept the growing Scandinavian population alive. Vaccines, well, it obviously refers to vaccines, but also to an improvement in medicine and healthcare more generally. Vaccines started to become widespread in the 19th century, and this saved the lives of countless children, helping to cut child mortality in half, from 20% in the year 1800 to 10% a century later. As welcome a development as fewer dead children is, the growing population wasn't only a blessing to Scandinavian society. As we've seen in previous episodes, the population in the countryside started to grow exactly at the time when the number of people needed in the agrarian sector dropped. The number of landless peasants quadrupled in the first half of the 1800s, leading to unemployment and to people leaving their birthplaces to find work elsewhere. Sometimes elsewhere was at the sawmill in the next town over, but sometimes elsewhere meant America. So unemployment was a clear push factor. Another one was compulsory military service. Even though liberal and radical politicians argued for the importance of compulsory conscription and citizen participation in the armed defense of one's home country, many of those men who were actually supposed to carry out that armed defense were far less keen. Some of them went so far as to emigrate to America to avoid serving in the army. A third push factor was a stifling political and societal climate. 19th century Scandinavia was still a rigid class society with legally protected privileges for certain elite groups, for example the aristocracy and the clergy. There were established state churches which held Scandinavian society in a firm grip. The whole "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion" was completely alien to Scandinavian society, where the monarch, cabinet ministers, members of parliament, and senior members of the state administration all had to belong to the state church by law. Lay people were also forbidden from conducting any religious services, and even after it became legal to join a rival Protestant denomination, these alternative nonconformist or dissenter churches were distrusted and their members often ridiculed or looked down upon. And let's not even talk about Catholics. Converting to Catholicism meant that you lost your citizenship in Denmark until the new constitution was introduced in 1849, and in Sweden until 1873. Obviously, this bothered a lot of people who didn't belong to the state church, sometimes so much that they were willing to emigrate to practice their religion freely elsewhere. Another push factor was the limitation on financial development. Various monopolies and regulations hampered free enterprise and economic growth. So some financially driven people who wanted to make a fortune felt it would be much easier to do so on the other side of the Atlantic. In this context, it's worth noting that the immigrants weren't a monolithic group. Many of those who left for economic reasons were firm believers in the eternal truth of the message preached by the state church, and they established Scandinavian churches in the US with similar theology, parish structures, and functions as in the old country. As I'm sure you've figured out already, many of the push factors can also be described as pull factors. The US was seen by many Scandinavians as a land of freedom from political repression, religious demands, and a place where you could realize your dreams, not least by obtaining land and establishing a farm of your own. Many of the farmhands who were sick of working for someone else emigrated. That was their only realistic hope of ever getting a piece of land of their own to establish a farm on, to be their own man. Others, who weren't interested in becoming farmers in Minnesota, were attracted by the bigger job market. When mills or industries closed down, many of the workers would emigrate to America. For instance, in 1891, when the sawmills of the Swedish Gold Coast suffered from overproduction and falling prices, 462 people emigrated to the US and Canada from the town of Sundsvall alone in 1 year, and another 348 sawmill workers emigrated to Brazil. Sometimes US companies or even the government try to poach specific groups of skilled workers. For example, during the American Civil War in the 1860s, mines in the north needed workers because there weren't enough skilled miners around to supply the metal required for the war effort. So the Union government invested $90,000 in an ad campaign in Scandinavia to get skilled miners and metallurgy workers to emigrate to the US. Sometimes people who had emigrated before could function as a pull factor as well. For example, immigrants often wrote letters about their new lives in America to their folks back home. These letters became a pull factor in some cases, tempting potential immigrants with tales of financial success, religious freedom, and endless cornfields. Naturally, many of the letter writers had a tendency to exaggerate their own success and how great life was in the new country, thereby justifying their decision to move away. These so-called America letters became something of a genre in itself, and papers and magazines would sometimes print such letters. Sometimes shipping lines would pay to have America letters real or fictional, published in order to boost ticket sales across the Atlantic. But some immigrants really did make it in America, and after a few years, they'd sometimes come back for a visit to their birthplaces. Former maids would show up in their poor homes wearing satin dresses, elegant hats with ostrich feathers, and no longer displaying deference to their former social superiors. This impressed those left behind. The visiting immigrants attracted attention and jealousy with their stories and elegant clothes. Just like the America letters, seeing such successful immigrants could also inspire further immigration. In the early days, the immigrants had to organize everything themselves. Typically, there was some charismatic local leader who led the whole operation and who immigrated himself as well. The people who were leaving, often whole families, sold everything they couldn't bring with them, including their farms, and traveled together in a group to the nearest port. There, they found passage on a ship that was sailing across the Atlantic, negotiated how much they had to pay to join the voyage, and set off. As long as the crossing was done on sail ships, the crossing was unpredictable, long, and dangerous. There were often diseases on board, and several immigrants died already before they ever reached America. But when steamships were introduced in the 1860s, the journeys became safer and faster. By coincidence, this was also the time of several bad harvests in Scandinavia, so there was a first peak in immigration during this decade. It wasn't just the passage itself that became smoother, though. The whole chaotic process of immigration was eventually also standardized and regulated. When shipping lines realized there was money to be made here, they established agencies specializing in immigration. To begin with, these were English companies, like the White Star Line and Cunard. But with time, Scandinavian and German lines entered the market as well. Also, the authorities got better organized. Remember, people moving about on a mass scale had never been a thing before, and passports and border controls hadn't been standardized. Now, a process was established for what you had to do to travel internationally, especially if you wanted to leave for good. If you wanted to emigrate, you first had to apply for an emigration permit from the parish where you lived. But it took time for the authorities to firm up this practice. Before the 1880s, the checks on these permits were spotty at the exit ports. Some people managed to immigrate using a kind of permit used to be allowed to look for work in a different parish than the one you lived in. Some resourceful potential immigrants who lacked any kind of permit even claimed to be US citizens who had just been visiting their place of birth. Once you had the permit, you could sign a contract with a shipping line for passage. With the permit and the contract, you then went to the police in the port to be allowed to actually embark on a ship that would take you abroad. And as if that wasn't enough, men of conscription age needed an extra permit from the military authorities to be allowed to emigrate. That permit essentially said that the army didn't need you and was meant to keep useful soldiers in the country. Some Swedish men who didn't obtain this last permit, but who weren't willing to give up on their dream to emigrate in order to serve in the armed forces, would sneakily travel to Copenhagen. The Danish authorities couldn't care less if the Swedish army wanted you to report for duty and would allow these men to emigrate via Denmark. It didn't take long for the Swedes to figure out that this loophole existed, but when they asked the Danes to start requiring Swedish immigrants to show their military permits before embarkation, the Danish authorities refused to cooperate. The lack of manpower in the Swedish army was not their problem. Besides, they made lots of money from the immigration of Swedes of military age. So, how much did it cost to emigrate? Well, the price varied greatly. In the early years, it wasn't just more complicated, it was also much more expensive. Later, when it became a mass thing, with established routes and routines, the price dropped. Immigration soon became big business, and in Scandinavia, papers and magazines were full of ads as well as content paid for by the shipping lines extolling the glories of life in America, all to entice people to buy tickets to cross the Atlantic. Perhaps counterintuitively, the tickets cost the most when the ships were the fullest. That's because the shipping lines got together and rigged the prices. This arrangement only fell apart when the number of emigrants fell and the lines had to start to compete with each other to fill their ships. But it never became cheap. In today's money, you'd have to pay thousands of dollars for a one-way ticket to America, and that meant that the poorest of the poor couldn't afford to emigrate, even if they'd wanted to, at least not on their own. Some had relatives in America who sponsored them and bought prepaid tickets. At times, these prepaids were a large part of the immigrants. Sometimes, one family member was sent over first to make money to pay for tickets for the rest of the family. Often, the husband would go first and later send prepaid tickets to his wife and kids. But not only family members used the system of prepaid tickets. In the beginning, some companies, such as mines, would also pay prepaid tickets to immigrants who would have to work off the debt for the tickets in the mines after they reached America. But this practice was eventually banned, though. Most Scandinavians who immigrated to America got off the ship in New York, Boston, or Quebec in Canada. Some stayed in these port cities, but many immigrants, especially in the first decades, dreamed of land. So their journey wasn't over yet. Instead, they continued west. Quite a few Scandinavians ended up in Chicago, a natural choice since it's a hub between the vast farmlands to the west, the Great Lakes, and the communications back east. The first immigrants, or I guess we can start calling them immigrants at this point, they soon disappeared in the great mass of people in the big cities, but after a while, enclaves were established where their original identity could be preserved. For example, in the year 1900, Chicago was the city in the world with the largest Swedish population after Stockholm. But, with all due respect to New York and Chicago, most of the early Scandinavian immigrants had come to establish farms, and for that they needed to continue even further west. The majority of them settled in the region around the Great Lakes or in the Northwest, New York and Massachusetts. Minnesota became particularly popular. In 1910, 45% of Swedish immigrants lived in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Illinois, or Iowa. For Norwegians, the number was 65% for these same states. The Danes weren't as concentrated in the same corner of the US, and since a fair number of them settled in California, only 40% were found in the Midwest. And only about a quarter of the Finns settled in these states, but another quarter settled in the state of Michigan alone. The Icelanders stood out even more, since most of them settled in Manitoba and Saskatchewan in Canada. So, why did these people settle where they did? One popular explanation is meteorological. The climate simply reminded them of home, and that's why they chose to settle where they did. Clearly, that's not the case for the Danes who moved to California, and I'm not convinced the theory is very good in general either. It's true that the weather in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Illinois, and Iowa is quite similar to Scandinavia, but there's another, better explanation. Almost all of the first immigrants were farmers, and they wanted farmland, which they found in the Midwest. Buying land at the frontier was cheap, and becoming a farmer there was a realistic goal for many who could never afford it back home. In 1862, the US Congress passed one of the so-called Homestead Acts. This particular one allowed you to get 160 acres of unclaimed land for free. After having worked the land for 5 years, the land became yours against a small $10 registration fee. This was a dream for many land-starved Scandinavians. And that's the real reason so many of them settled in the Midwest, not because the winters reminded them of home. But not everyone dreamed of becoming a Midwestern farmer. Especially from the 1890s onward, it became less common that people immigrated to settle on a farm, not least since the good land was running out, even in America. Instead, more and more immigrants stayed in the bigger cities and took jobs there. Many Norwegian sailors and sea officers settled around the Great Lakes, and some fishermen moved all the way to the Pacific coast. This way, they could continue with their profession from the old country, just like the farmers. And this pattern is clear for a lot of other professions as well. Many Swedes from the Gold Coast worked in logging and sawmills in the US and Canada, and Swedes, Finns and Norwegians with experience from mining continued with that in the new country. As I already mentioned, just like other immigrant groups, Scandinavians tended to settle where other Scandinavians already lived. For example, in mid-19th century Chicago, the Swedes lived in Andersonville and Swedetown. The Norwegians, on the other hand, tended to live in an infamous area called the Sands, close to the lakeshore. But as the generations passed, the immigrants' children and grandchildren left these enclaves as they became more affluent and more Americanized. The first generations of immigrants not only lived close to other Scandinavians, they also tended to marry within their own ethnic group. To begin with, they wouldn't even marry other Scandinavians, choosing instead to stick to their own Norwegians marrying Norwegians, Swedes marrying Swedes, and so on. This was especially true for Finns and Icelanders. In the Finnish case, there was a rather high language barrier to pass, and most of the Icelanders lived in Canada, at a safe distance from other Scandinavians. Almost all women married, and the vast majority of them married men from the same home country. They also had many children, just like at home. But because fewer women emigrated, and because of the gender imbalance, there were more women in town and more men at the frontier, quite a few immigrants in the first generations remained unmarried. Only a few of them married outside their own group, preferring to die single instead of marrying someone English, Dutch, or Italian. The preference to stick together and marry within their own group wasn't only based on prejudice. It also had practical reasons. Very few of the immigrants spoke English when they arrived in America. The first generation also largely lived lives where they got by with only very rudimentary knowledge of English. They stuck to their mother tongue at home, at church, and among friends. They tended to socialize with other immigrants from the same country as themselves, joining various Scandinavian clubs in the cities they lived in, if they lived in one. Religion was obviously a big deal for 19th century Scandinavians, and it kept being important even after they moved to America. Most immigrants joined a congregation where they used their mother tongue. If there was no such church around, they'd go to another Scandinavian congregation, but they stayed away from English or German-speaking churches. Still, living in the US meant that they couldn't avoid English altogether. Some basic knowledge of it was needed for most jobs and whenever you had to be in touch with the authorities. Their children also learned English in school. That meant that the children usually spoke English much better than their parents, and the first generation of immigrants sometimes became dependent on their offspring for communication in English. But over time, English seeped in, of course. The immigrants' grandchildren were usually monolingual in English, rarely speaking much of the old language beyond a heavily accented smattering of phrases and random words. The process sped up during the First World War, when it became a patriotic duty to learn English. A law was passed that immigrants needed to learn English, and this was a big change that did much to eradicate Scandinavian culture in America. Immigrants in the 1920s worked harder to learn English and to integrate than previous generations had done. Clear signs of this linguistic assimilation were that immigrants' newspapers started to publish articles in English to keep their readership, and the nominally Scandinavian congregations started to conduct services in English so that the congregants would know what was going on. Language is obviously a glaring sign of foreign roots, but there were other traditions and customs as well, and they too changed over time, but not always as quickly and as definitely as the language. One example is Christmas traditions. For instance, food. Ham and porridge went first, but potato sausage and lutefisk held out for longer, which I have to admit is something I find surprising because lutefisk would be the first thing I'd ditch if I had the option. The day you'd hand out your Christmas gifts was also another telltale sign of your level of integration. In Scandinavia, it's done on December 24th, but after a few generations in the US, most immigrants had surrendered to the American tradition of waiting until December 25th. Another such sign was when they started to celebrate Thanksgiving, a holiday that was completely unknown outside the US. At the end of the day, though, as a rule, Scandinavian immigrants integrated easily and were completely assimilated within a couple of generations. That process was made even smoother by the fact that they were largely welcome in America. In the late 1800s, skepticism and hostility to immigrants grew, but it was mostly directed against Catholics, Southern Europeans, Jews, and Chinese immigrants. Scandinavians were white and Protestant, so they encountered far fewer obstacles on their way to becoming accepted in their new home country. So, how many Scandinavians did actually emigrate to America in the century between 1830 and 1930? The short answer is many. If we break it down by country, it looks something like this. Approximately 300,000 Danes emigrated. Most of them did so during the years 1868 to 1914, when the First World War temporarily stopped migration across the Atlantic. Another 15,000 people emigrated from Iceland, which was a Danish possession at the time. That may not sound like much, but if you take into account that the total population was only 70,000 and that most of the immigrants were young adults, you quickly realize that it was a real problem for the island. Most of the Icelanders settled in Gimli, Manitoba, a place almost no one had heard of before July 23, 1983. Norway lost about 860,000 people who emigrated between 1836 and 1910. Most of them left in the last half-century, and as many as 29,000 left in the year 1882 alone. Even though the lion's share settled in the US, some went to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and even all the way to Sweden. After Ireland, Norway is actually the country with the highest number of per capita emigration during this period. During the century we're talking about here, 1.3 million Swedes emigrated. The culmination came in the 1880s, and even though the First World War put a temporary pin in the immigration, there was a second, smaller peak in the early 1920s, when times were tough in Sweden. But the Great Depression in 1929 put a definite end to mass immigration to America. In 1910, there were 665,000 people born in Sweden living in the US. They, in turn, had 700,000 children born in the US. At the time, Sweden had a population of 5.5 million. That meant that approximately 1 in 5 Swedes lived in the US. Also in Finland, mass immigration, known as America fever, peaked in the late 1800s and continued until the First World War. 300,000 Finns moved to America, and another 100,000 also moved to Russia, hoping to find a better future at the heart of the empire. Little did they know. In case you haven't been tallying up the numbers, I can reveal that almost 3 million Scandinavians immigrated in about a century. Obviously, that sort of thing doesn't go unnoticed. Which begs the question, how did those left behind react? Well, to begin with, the authorities actually liked the fact that poor people left. It reduced the pressure from the growing population that didn't have anything to do or any way to feed themselves. But after a while, their outlook started to shift. So many people left that it was becoming a problem. Some even saw it as a threat to national survival. In some towns, it became tricky to find enough workers to keep the mills and factories going. That led factory owners and other industrialists to fear having to raise wages or otherwise compete with each other to improve the conditions for the workers. Also, the countryside started to become depleted of young workers in certain areas. Farmers and large landowners feared that the pool of cheap farmhands would dry up. One parish priest in Sweden reported that a farmer with 7 sons still had to leave his farm to his son-in-law because all 7 sons had emigrated. As we've already seen, in high military circles, especially in Stockholm, they started to worry as well. They feared that there wouldn't be enough men around to fill the ranks of the army. In the 1880s, when the migration peaked, the politicians debated what could be done to limit immigration, either by convincing potential immigrants to stay or by stopping them from leaving somehow. Especially men of recruitment age should be kept in the country. We have already seen how easy it was to get around that, though. In the public debate during these years, critics of immigration described those who moved away as unpatriotic, and they expressed regret that simple people thought they could satisfy their baser desires and live in comfort in America instead of living good, honest, hard-working lives in Scandinavia, where they belonged. In northern Sweden, the owners of large sawmills had been buying up farms from families who immigrated and planted forests on the former farmland. By the year 1900, the logging companies owned as much as 78% of the farmland in northern Sweden. By that stage, the authorities started to worry about the depopulation of this part of the country, which had been colonized relatively recently. In 1906, the Riksdag banned logging companies from buying farmland to protect the farmers in the north. In 1907, the National Association Against Emigration was founded in Sweden. They both tried to spread realistic news from America to counteract the favorable image of the place, but also provide subsidized mortgages to people who wanted to establish homes and farms in Sweden to weaken their incentive to leave. Most of these measures had limited effect, though. Still, immigration eventually petered out. There were several reasons for this. First of all, as I've mentioned, the First World War halted almost all immigration for a few years, and even though the traffic started up again after the war, it really wasn't the same. Another reason was that things were improving at home. so there were fewer push factors. But what really put an end to the age of immigration was the Great Depression. A better financial future had always been the big pull factor, and when that was gone, people stopped moving to America. Some even returned. In the early years of immigration, when crossing the Atlantic was difficult and dangerous, and there was still lots of good land to be had in America, relatively few immigrants returned. For most, crossing the Atlantic was a one-way voyage. But 50 years later, things had changed. Not only were people able to go back to visit the old country to show off their success, some also chose to return permanently. Life in America wasn't for everyone. Some never made it, some couldn't adapt to the foreign environment. And some had always planned to only stay for a few years, make some money, and then return to start a family back home. Mostly men returned. The women stayed. In fact, only 25% of those who returned were women. That's partly because women either went with their families or married someone in America. In addition, their jobs were less affected by the economy, since most of them who didn't end up running a household on a Scandinavian farm on the frontier worked as domestic servants in some affluent household in Chicago, New York, or some other big city. But those who returned were a minority. For about 9 out of 10 immigrants, America became their new home. And if my listener statistics is anything to go by, quite a few of you listening to this show are descendants of those immigrants. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.